Activism is the heartbeat of consciousness, or is it? Sometimes activists, media-savvy mavens, and magnetic communicators can convolute a serious cause. But is their activism in vain? Can Stephen Colbert's coined term, truthiness, bleed into activism and infect the nature of the cause? Labor movements, women's liberation, civil rights activism, and the role of media meet at the crossroads on CounterPoint with Gerard McClendon. Is activism still needed in the age of infotech? Does media play a role in its impact? How is the voice of reason communicated and heard in a world of competing interests? Give me a call at 844-777-9311. You can send me a tweet or send me a Facebook comment to Gerard MC at the CounterPoint today. We've got Eve Batondo from Indiana University Northwest, and Sheila Garland from the National Nurses United. Ladies, thank you so much for being on the CounterPoint today. We really appreciate you. Heavy topic. We've got a brand new president that's going to be taking office. We've got social media that's just on fire right now. Activism and civil rights organizations have become awake again, and we're seeing that activism and communication is very important to a person's survival or to people's survival. So let's first start by asking the question, what's more important, the medium or the movement, the communication or the cause when it comes to activism? Either of you want to start us off here today?
Well, I don't think you can have a movement without both. Because without the ability to communicate what the purpose of the cause is, it's really hard to build for a movement, I think, number one. Number two, I think, when you talk about activism in and of itself as an entity that stands alone, it's kind of sort of difficult to imagine that in my world. Activism without a level of consciousness is just activity that really doesn't lead anywhere. So, but if you have a coherent sort of idea or an agenda or a program about where you want to go, then you're going to integrate all aspects of, developing consciousness, communication. How do you use the various communication tools at our disposal? Every age, you had different tools of communication. Times ago, you stand on a street corner and do the soapbox. Now we do, Twitter and Facebook. So
good, and I'm glad you started us off there, because I'm going to come to you, Dr. Batanda. The importance of communicating a message and why the communicator, regardless of the medium you use, why the communicator and what he or she says is so important. Is there a more influential way of communicating a message, whether it's activism, whether it's propaganda, whether it's advertising? What are the tools that a communicator can use to activate a point of view?
I'll go for a very strange example. Let's go to Mount Sinai. Tablets, Moses, stone, very old mode of communication. But why does this message continue? It was because of the personal relationships and networks established between Moses and the Jewish people. That's how the message continues. What we realize, what social media helps us realize, what I've learned as a teacher, is that these personal networks are the ways that we get our messages out. It's affinity, it's desire, it's love. And that love connected to particular consciousness, which can also be something it can turn violent. Yeah. Remember that the voice of Hitler helped inspire lots of people. And the fact that his voice was amplified was key to getting that message out and inspiring many different people towards a decision that killed many people and put into place infrastructures for that killing.
So the communication, of course, is the thing that is used to drive a point forward, to drive activism forward, but it seems to be an ethics issue that comes into play as well. There's a morality play that we have here. And let's talk, I'm glad you opened that up in terms of the tablets, in terms of communication, because when we look at National Nurses United,
okay.
all right? Nurses go through hell throughout the course of a day, all right? Sometimes people on the outside say, oh, nurses make a lot of money. They can deal with it. Nurses deal with some circumstances that can become hazardous at times, but they're compensated well. Why is there a need for activism or a labor union when it comes to nurses?
Well, primarily because you want to protect your patients. When you silence the nurse's voice at the bedside, that means that your patient is in greater harm. So unionized nurses who have collective bargaining agreements have the ability to negotiate how they can better protect and advocate for the patient. If you don't have that ability, if your voice is silenced as a registered bedside nurse, then the kind of things that we see happening to patients in hospitals that are non-union, even hospitals that are unionized, where they, where the hospital industry, the healthcare industry is always trying to maximize its profit. It's always trying to reach its bottom line. Because they're financial centers, right? You have, they're leveraging their stock so they can constantly buy, enrich the CEO. They starve out, what happens at the bedside in terms of supplies, equipment, staff, all those things are cut for the sake of profit.
So this is where the activism starts then. It starts with the nurse trying to do the best job they can for the patient, but the nurse has to be taken care of as well, or else there'd be no labor union for nurses. So let's get right into that issue. Besides the patient, how do we need to activate to take care of nurses?
So, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think everything in society is connected. And I think that there are processes that are underway that have historical antecedents and that serve a purpose for those that rule versus those that have no power. So it really is a power play about who has the power and what is it that you do in order to maintain that power, expand that power, and create the sort of influences in society at large in order for your ideas to grab hold and to become the centerpiece of any sort of historical period that we're living in. You have to put it within its context. If you go back to the advent of religion, what purpose did it serve for when you had the ability to extract a bit of surplus? That meant that you had a certain group of people that could engage in leisure. So when you have the ability to engage in leisure, you're not so ground down by work, you can sort of think about and do things that you would not have ordinarily been able to do if you were out there grubbing and,
Yeah. Aristotle, Plato,
Exactly.
Socrates talked about leisure
Right.
and talked about the ability to ponder.
Exactly.
Which is,
important.
some people look at it as a waste of time,
No, it's
but
important.
unless you can ponder, you can't think deeply about a specific subject. I saw your hand,
So,
Doctor.
to go with what Sheila's saying, the activism, nurses need unions and they need a voice because they need a messaging system, right? They need to come together and work together to get their message out about care to patients, because it's already a part of the hospital infrastructure to have public relations, to have relationships with newspapers, and to traditionally be the ones who are sourced when people have a question. When they ask a question about healthcare, they don't ask the nurses.
Do professors need a union?
Absolutely.
Does every worker in the United States need a union?
Absolutely.
Or if I'm the owner of a business and I say, I frown upon unions, right to work. You work for these wages or else.
Well, let's
and if you don't want to work for these wages, I'm not going to give you a voice. You can work elsewhere. Talk to me.
So listen, every single industry, they're organized. They collectivize their power. They collectivize their ability to leverage what they need in terms of politics, in terms of getting votes, paying off our elected officials. So there is collectivized power when you go up the hierarchy. However, the message to the masses is that you need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You have to go at it individually. You have to go at it. So in terms of communicating a message, because this is inherent, right? This is inherent in the system that we live under. The kind of messaging that we get really kind of predicate how we then react in our society at large. So for those workers who think that they're going to emulate what the wealthy people do, that all I have to do is just make money on my own. They don't see the interconnectedness between how in those circles they work together. They say, well, I have an idea. Let's go after this.
So
Let's
how
figure
is
out how
the
to buy
voice?
you
So
out.
the voice of the powerful is more powerful than the voice of the weak?
I disagree that that's
Yeah.
true. But I also think it's foolhardy to not take into consideration how power is vetted and expanded out into the society at large and who has control of it. Working people do have control. That's why you have unions, we have other worker organizations and other community groups and those sorts of things that give us the ability to articulate our demands, right?
But there has to be solidarity.
Well, look, no one who believes in this, the student that graduates from my university that's not union, right? But they've taken my courses and we've discussed all sorts of realms about what's possible when you join together to communicate. If they believe it's really most important that I go out there and fight for my point of view, they are not a dupe, first of all. They are not a dupe for believing in that. However, it's really important that we take a moment to stop and pause and think about what Sheila's saying. There is collective action happening. Maybe, each CEO isn't in together talking about it, but there are ways that people get used to getting work done. And those ways are not accessible to the average nurse or the average professor, but when we join together, we can make a joyful noise.
Yeah.
Could I talk for a moment about why I went to Dakota Access?
Hold on
hold
tight
on
to
that.
that because I may have to wait to the next segment for that, but we'll definitely open up with that. I do want to ask you this before we leave, though. Do you think that unions should always exist?
So,
Hey, make it quick.
Okay, so from my perspective,
Yes or no?
yes, I think unions should exist.
What about you?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
More.
Okay, hey, you know what? It's getting heated. Is activism still needed in the age of infotech? Does media play a role in its impact? How is the voice of reason communicated and heard in a world of competing interests? I've got Eve Batondo from IUN and Sheila Garland from National Nurses United. Stay with us for more Counterpoint. Tweet me, post on Instagram, or send me a message on Facebook. Let's start the conversation. Your voice is important on Counterpoint. Is activism still needed in the age of information and technology? Does media play a role in its impact? How is the voice of reason communicated and heard in a world of competing interests? I've got Dr. Eve Batondo from IUN and Sheila Garland from National Nurses United. Thanks for staying with us for the second half. Man, I got Nurses United, I got professors in the mix, and now we could talk about the Dakota Pipeline. Man, you talk about activism meeting business in a severe way. Talk to us. You had some access to the Dakota situation.
Well, I had access because I'm a public professor at a university studying media and how media matter in our world. And I had students who follow me on Facebook saying, after taking classes with me, that, hey, let's check in at Standing Rock. And if we check in at Standing Rock, that will mean anybody that's there won't actually be surveilled by the police. Now, I taught classes about this. Likely, the police aren't probably figuring out how to do the check-in thing, but the fact that people believed in it, and all these folks checked in for a myriad of reasons, I wanted to go and find out what was actually happening on the ground.
What was actually happening?
Well,
we kind of know the outcome, but what was actually happening? What was on the ground?
when you get in, before you're able to go into any of the camps, you get an orientation and you agree to these simple rules. No drugs, no alcohol, no weapons, and you are a guest of the Sioux people. You're not there for whatever you thought you were coming there for.
You're not there for recreation. You're not there for a photo op. You're there to benefit and to try to cohabitate and to make sure that the cause gets drawn forth and the people are respected.
So yeah, we had nurses on the ground in Standing Rock. So we worked with medic tents and providing health care, particularly when the clashes became violent on the part of the state. So we were actually working with and taking care of those folks that had been injured, making sure people didn't get in frostbite, just very basic, kind of healthcare needs. And so National Nurses United has stood extraordinarily strong in our solidarity with what was happening there. And like the professor is saying, there were certain rules. You didn't go in there with your own agenda. So the importance of communicating what was at stake. This was about the power of this government and the corporations that are seeking to essentially destroy, right, our water supplies, soil, sacred sites.
Manifest destiny.
I mean, it's worse than manifest destiny because it's that in the age of technology.
So let's talk about this, because activism had to take place there, didn't it? Pretty obvious.
Well, this is their land.
It could have gone terribly wrong. And so what was the importance of communicating the message and people using social media to get the message out? If you remember, the first few weeks, very few people in the United States were even interested because it wasn't getting the top-notch media coverage. All of a sudden, people started using Twitter, people started using Facebook Live, and then you started to see things pop.
Well, it's all about sourcing. Understand that the media are trying to get the message out, and they want to go for the sources that are official and tested. So you go to government sources, you go to the sheriff. You don't go to the nurses, you don't go to the nurses union, and you don't go to professors who happen to be driving in their Jeep across country to go find out what's happening. And so because of that sourcing, then that's the only story that gets told.
Yeah.
That's why I got in my Jeep and left. It was important as an educator that I knew. I felt it was ethically responsible, and that's why so many people went there. Nurses taking time off and getting support from wherever they were to go and help take care of folks, because that story was not getting told. But as more and more people showed up, more and more people put out their own messages, more and more people insisted that their voice get heard.
But
The sourcing had to change.
Good. So let's look at the counterpoint.
Okay.
You dig the pipeline. Do you benefit more? Do you benefit society more by building the pipeline, manifest destiny, or are the few greater than the many?
To me, that's kind of the wrong question. To me, the question is, what is the impact of digging for fossil fuels?
What's the impact of us having fluorocarbons and people driving cars every day? We still drive cars, and we're hurting portions of society.
Right.
So do you think that activism sometimes takes on an approach that is individual and not collective? Because the reason why I got to give you the counterpoint is because there are things that we all consume in society that are bad and wrong for others, but we justify them because they're good for me.
So, I mean, taking that premise, we're always going to end up at a dead end when you take that premise.
Because
the reason why I say that is because the kinds of commodities that are available to us are not necessarily in our control for production. They're the commodities that really benefit a few. So if the majority of people are able to talk about what kind of commodities or what do we need in order to secure ourselves, the conversation is very different. I've been working out in East Chicago as well as on the southeast side of Chicago around the lead and the pet coke issue.
EPA
nightmare. These are the kind of issues that affect people directly in terms of our health, in terms of the community, just our ability to live without the violence of digging up and harming us on a regular and a daily, our air and whatever. So I think the question has to be a lot different.
I grew up in Hammond. I spent a lot of my time in East Chicago, in West Calumet. A lot of my friends were there. What was interesting about West Calumet, there seemed to be an exorbitant amount of cancer cases in that area. Some close friends of mine died in their 30s. They went to East Chicago, the old East Chicago Roosevelt, East Chicago East Chicago Roosevelt at the time. Late 20s, early 30s, dying of cancer.
The health toll of our sort of demand, and when I say our, I'm talking about the corporate demand for fossil fuels and for dirty technology is killing us.
So there needs to be activism for that.
So not just activism, but it has to be who is going to lead that political demand, because activity, as I said earlier, by itself doesn't get you anywhere.
But if the politician doesn't lead that, that particular movement, do we need activists outside of political figures to push them? Lyndon B. Johnson said it best, right? He said, Martin Luther King, make me do it. Make me sign the Civil Rights Bill. So even though we live in this world where we think everyone should be ethical, sometimes you have to have some pushback from someone saying, you're wrong, and we're going to show you and the world that you're wrong. Now do something about it.
What we need to listen to Sheila's advice. You have to ask the right questions. You cannot sit there and look at Lyndon B. Johnson or Martin Luther King or the latest politician or whoever's behind the mic as the activist. You need to learn how to ask good questions. Don't follow the distracting line. So let's focus here on what's going on with Dakota Access Pipeline. Don't get thrown off onto all the different ways that a Twitter-based form of communication will send you, because it will send you to panic and fear.
Yeah.
Go away from that. Panic and fear disrupts our ability to stop, pause, and think carefully about what's going on.
Activism, what's more important, boots on the ground or air attack with media?
Both.
Yeah.
You need both.
So even though with Dakota Access, we saw how important the internet was, we saw how important social media was, but the people still had to go there. You still had to get in the car and go there.
Let me give a detail, just a little detail about how media work over at the Standing Rock Oceti-Sakowin camp. You're not allowed to take pictures. This is both cultural and a respect issue. Now you see a lot of pictures, those people they've shown responsibility enough to be able to take pictures. And so when I came there, as someone that didn't know nothing about nothing, I came there with a camera and I didn't take pictures. I didn't publish pictures from inside the camp. I only went to where I was allowed to go. So actually, to understand what was happening, people who were trained, so before you go out in a direct action, you have to be trained on camp. And if you're trained to be one of the documenting folks, the media people in the group, then you take pictures. And that's so important because the camera from another angle helps shed light on that different facet of what's going on.
Yeah, that's true. The camera does shed light.
So, and I will say that every struggle has its own processes and its own sort of rules. What defined the struggles around civil rights or around women's liberation or LGBTQ rights around Standing Rock? Who are we going up against? And what is it that we know about who our enemy is? Who are the people that we ally with in order to move our demand forward? Every single fight that we engage in historically in this country has been defined by the people who have built the fight, right? Because they're the ones who understand the nature of that fight. So it's kind of hard to lump everything together given how we've organized historically in the past.
Yeah.
What we're lacking, I think, in the way we organize in this society and in this period is that we lack the breaking down of silos, of independent politics. The independent politics works very, very well for the ruling class, because if I'm only going to be interested in my particular fight, that means I'm not going to reach across and join up with the next fight, because we all have a common enemy that we're fighting.
So is the common enemy ethereal, a gaseous substance, or is the common enemy concrete? So, for instance, when people say, we're going to fight against the man and shut things down on Black Friday, does that even make any sense if you're not going toward the so-called man or the so-called enemy who is direct? Who is the enemy?
Every fight is incremental.
Okay.
You can't, so you have targets, you have goals. I mean, there are certain things that you do along the way. So the demand to stop the commodification of our lives by forcing us to buy at certain periods of time in order to enrich a system that doesn't give back to certain communities,
Got
be
you.
they black or white, immigrant, documented or undocumented, LGBTQ, whatever those communities are, versus having the broader fight, right, around collectivizing all of these fights and saying, yeah, now the man is, you
Yeah.
can sort of point your finger at the man. But I think people have to engage at a certain level in order to develop
Can
that.
I got
say
about
this
20
one
seconds
thing?
left.
The enemy can be your best buddy from grade school. How does that work? Because someone that I have a love for can become a lobbyist to try to shut down freedom of speech on the internet or try to commodify all those things that I love. But I also love that person. This is the world that we have to accept. We've always been living it.
Yeah.
As a college professor, I get that privilege. Privilege is really the right word.
Yes.
Because I can float in between a lot of circles. I'm allowed into the elites,
Yeah.
right? As well as allowed into the common day working
And
folks.
I got to bring both of you back for part two because this discussion is so rich. You know what? Yes, we do need activists, people who push a message of ethics, morality, speaking truth to power so that our existence doesn't become one of lockstep puppetry. But the fiber of the cause must be the dominant force, not necessarily the demagogue who champions the effort. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle remarked over 2,300 years ago, every art, every inquiry, every action is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Is your activism aiming at something good? Facebook Gerard at Gerard MC. Call me, 844-777-9311. Thanks for watching CounterPoint. Stay positive, keep your head up, and always be encouraged. Have a great week.